for being there today. We've got lots of questions to be answered, clearly.
Go on.
My question is a question that we've had for about 3.5 years, I guess, is how is this physically possible? Effectively, we have 4 months to renegotiate our trade deal with the European Union. The February's going to be gone discussing about the contents of what's going to be negotiated. Then by the end of June, at that point, we almost have to draw a line under it before it has to go across to 27 countries, member state parliaments, national parliament, and all the regional parliaments, including Wallonia and Belgium that held up the Canada deal. It'll take them at least 4 months, probably 6, to ratify any final trade agreement. This has got to include tariffs, quotas, customs duties, rules of origin, transportation of nuclear material, aviation, electronic data communications, copyright, civil justice, social justice, company law, animal feed, clinical state, and a whole host of other things. All have to be renegotiated inside 4 months.
And your question presumably is how?
Not just that. Then we've got between July and December.
I'm going to have to push you to ask a question, Jason, or I'd have had you on the panel. Come on, give me a question.
Okay. The question is, on top of that, we've got another 600 agreements, international agreements, between the EU and 160 other countries around the world. How is Boris Johnson going to get Brexit done?
Okay, there you go. Anna Manol.
Well, there are a lot of assumptions there, Jason. Firstly, that we're going to negotiate everything by the end of the year. We're not. We can't. You're absolutely right. If the government negotiates something quite minimal with the EU, like a trade deal that just covers goods, you don't need ratification in all member states and all member states' parliament. It's what's called, it won't be a mixed agreement, which means that the EU itself can ratify it. So there are ways of speeding the process up. And trade deals can come into effect before they've been ratified. You can have conditional implementations. So there are ways around this. But the fundamental issue that you've touched on is we're not going to get a comprehensive deal with the European Union at the end of the year. So the question is whether we'll get a partial one and whether the Prime Minister and the EU will agree as part of that partial one that they'll find a mechanism to keep things ticking over as close to as they are now as possible while they negotiate the rest.
And that could last how long, in your view? Decades? A decade?
But if you talk to the Swiss, what they'll tell you is being a neighbour of the European Union basically means an endless, open-ended series of negotiations with the European Union that never end, because you're always tinkering with that. EU's changing its rules, you're changing your rules. We will always be in some form of negotiation.
Because it's always going to be a dance. Because
both sides are going to be changing stuff. Things will happen that we hadn't anticipated. But to get an actual deal, Jason's right, we won't get a massive, comprehensive deal that covers everything we do with the EU from policing to the economy, but we might get something small.
Ben?
Well, I think Jason hit the nail on the head, really. There is no real feasible prospect of getting the broad and comprehensive trade deal, that's what the UK and the EU have committed to in the political declaration, done by the end of the year. Now, there is the option, of course, of extending that transition period, but Boris Johnson, firstly, would need to decide that by June, if that's to be extended beyond the end of this year. He's also enshrined in law that he won't. So politically, it's very hard to do so. So as Anand says, I suspect what we'll end up with is a kind of bare bones deal, maybe some fudge way of extending the transition in some areas. But no, the idea of a trade deal that normally takes 5 to 7 years is going to be done in 8 months, because it's not even started.
And the Westminster politics of all of this, the optics, as they say, for Boris Johnson, are huge, aren't they?
They are. I think people were surprised when he did put it in law that the transition wouldn't be extended, because only a few months after a general election with a majority of 80, he'd delayed things before. Of course, he promised to get Brexit done by last October and didn't. I don't think it would have been as damaging as perhaps they feared if they'd extended the transition by a year or two. But putting it in law is a pretty big gesture, and it's hard to go back on that.
Chris asks, how will Brexit affect Gibraltar?